Henry Bailey thought he'd seen everything until a 6-year-old girl in a red sweater walked into his glass-walled office, handed him a handwritten resume, and said, "I need a job." Henry Bailey's morning began like most of his others, early, efficient, and structured to the minute. His luxury sedan pulled into the underground garage of the glass and steel tower he owned, and by 8 a.m., he was already in his office on the top floor reviewing quarterly projections. His suit was crisp, his tie flawless, and his espresso untouched as he scanned emails with the practiced intensity of a man who had long ago stopped noticing how much power he held. His schedule was packed with meetings, calls, and presentations, and he had no intention of deviating from it. At least not until his assistant, visibly pale and hesitant, knocked and opened the door without waiting for a reply. "Sir, there's someone here to see you." "It's a little girl," she said awkwardly, holding a small sheet of paper in her hand, as if unsure whether to laugh or panic. Henry looked up, confused. "A child," he repeated flatly, expecting some kind of misunderstanding. Before he could finish his thought, the office door opened wider, and in walked the most unexpected visitor of his career. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her light brown hair was slightly tangled, her brown eyes large and calm. She wore a red sweater, a denim skirt, and scuffed sneakers. A small worn backpack rested on her shoulders, and in her hands, she held a single piece of paper. Without waiting for anyone to speak, she walked up to his desk, stood on tiptoes to reach it, and placed the paper down. Then she looked up and said as clearly and directly as if this were the most normal thing in the world, "I need a job." Henry didn't respond immediately. He wasn't even sure how to. The room was silent, except for the hum of the city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Slowly, he picked up the paper. It was a child's attempt at a resume. Written in large, uneven letters, it said, "I can clean. I am quiet. I don't cry in front of people. I can help. I can learn." There were stars drawn in the corners and a small, shaky heart next to the line that read, "Please." He set the paper down, looked at her again, and knelt beside his chair. His voice softened as he asked, "Why are you here, sweetheart? You're a little girl. You don't need a job." She stared at him, not blinking, and answered with a calmness far beyond her years. "My mom is dying," she said. No tears, no drama, just truth. The air in the room shifted. Henry, a man who had built empires and shut down competitors without flinching, felt his throat tighten. She said like she'd said it many times before, like she had accepted it but refused to surrender to it. Her little hands were clenched into fists at her sides, and her voice didn't shake. "I have to help her," she added. "We don't have money. If I work, maybe she can stay alive." For a moment, Henry Bailey, the man who thought he'd seen everything, couldn't breathe. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because for the first time in years, someone had walked into his office and reminded him what it meant to feel helpless. And yet this little girl wasn't helpless. She had walked in by herself. She had a mission, and she had come straight to the top. He stood slowly, the paper still in his hand, and said, "What's your name?" The girl answered without hesitation, "Emma. Emma Miller." That was the moment his world began to change. He didn't know it yet, but nothing about his life, his company, his values, his definition of strength would ever be the same again. Henry stood in the center of his office, holding Emma's handwritten resume, his mind spinning with questions and 1,000 conflicting thoughts. The girl stood there silently, waiting, her eyes focused, her small frame completely still. There was no trace of fear or confusion in her posture, only determination. Henry had been pitched million-dollar ideas by industry leaders who couldn't command the room the way this 6-year-old just had. He sat down slowly in his chair, gesturing for her to sit across from him. She climbed into the oversized leather chair with effort, her feet not touching the ground, and folded her hands in her lap. He cleared his throat and leaned forward, keeping his tone calm. "Emma, do you know where you are?" She nodded without hesitation. "You're Mr. Bailey. You have lots of money. My mom said the people with money are the ones who can help when no one else does." Her answer was so matter-of-fact it left him briefly stunned. Henry glanced at his assistant, still frozen in the doorway, and signaled for her to give them privacy. The door clicked shut, and the office fell into a silence broken only by the sound of traffic far below. Henry leaned forward again, this time more gently. Can you tell me what happened to your mom? Emma nodded. She's sick. She doesn't tell me everything, but I know it's her body. She used to be strong. She can't work anymore, and the hospital said it costs too much. Her voice was clear, as if she'd rehearsed these words 100 times. We had to leave our apartment. Now we stay in one room, and she sleeps most of the time. Sometimes I make cereal for dinner. He felt something hard clench in his chest. He had grown up poor, but not like this. He had never been 6 years old and knocking on a CEO's door asking for employment. Does she know you came here? He asked softly. No, Emma said. She would have said no, but I looked up your name from a newspaper. I know your building because it's big and shiny, and people say you fix things fast. So I thought maybe you could fix this. Henry took a long breath and stood, walking over to the window. The city sprawled beneath him, vast and indifferent, and he realized how many people moved through it every day, quietly hurting, unseen. He turned back toward the girl, who was now swinging her legs slightly, her gaze resting on the bookshelf behind his desk. You're very brave, Emma, he said. Most adults wouldn't have had the courage to do what you just did. She shrugged. It's not brave. It's just what you do when you love someone. Her words hit harder than she could have known. Henry's own past flickered through his mind. Memories of walking away from people he'd cared about, chasing status, control, order. And here was this child standing in the rubble of her life, still choosing love before fear. He knelt again, eye level with her. Okay, he said quietly. Let's go see your mom. She blinked. Really? He nodded. I'm not promising everything, but I want to meet her, and I want to help if I can. She slid off the chair and adjusted the straps of her backpack. She's at Mercy Clinic, Emma said, her voice suddenly hopeful. Room 12. She sleeps a lot, but I think she'd like you. Henry smiled for the first time that day. Then let's go. And with that, he took a deep breath, grabbed his coat, and walked out of his office. Not to a board meeting or business lunch, but hand in hand with a 6-year-old girl who had just rewritten the most important rule of his life. Some things can't wait. The drive to Mercy Clinic felt longer than it was, not because of traffic or distance, but because of the weight of what Henry was walking into. He had spent his life surrounded by decisions measured in profit margins and performance charts. But now he was following a 6-year-old girl to meet a woman he'd never seen, driven not by strategy, but by something deeper, an ache in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Emma sat in the back seat of the company car, her legs swinging beneath her, her backpack clutched tightly in her lap. She didn't speak much, only offering directions when asked, and spent most of the ride staring out the window with a quiet focus that Henry found both heartbreaking and humbling. When they pulled up in front of the modest clinic, there was nothing remarkable about it, just a gray building with faded signage and windows too small to let in proper sunlight. But to Emma, it was clearly everything. She jumped out quickly, then waited beside the door until Henry joined her. As they entered the lobby, the nurse at the front desk looked up in surprise. Henry was still dressed in his tailored coat and expensive shoes, a presence that drew attention. But it was Emma who stepped forward and spoke first. Room 12, please, she said. She's my mom. The nurse hesitated, then nodded, pointing down the hallway. Henry followed Emma past worn tile floors and peeling paint, each step heavier than the last. When they reached the door, Emma paused, her small hand on the handle. She's really tired, she warned him. Sometimes she doesn't wake up when I talk to her. Henry gave a gentle nod, and Emma pushed open the door. Inside, the room was dim and quiet. A woman lay in the hospital bed, pale and thin, with 4 lines trailing from her arms and a heart monitor beeping in steady rhythm. Her face was delicate, worn by exhaustion, but peaceful in its stillness. Emma walked straight to her side, placed her backpack on the chair, and reached for her mother's hand. Mom, I brought someone, she whispered. He's the man I told you about. Henry stood at the foot of the bed, unsure how to move, unsure what to say. This woman, Sarah Miller, had clearly been through more than most people could handle. Her skin was almost translucent, her chest rising slowly as if every breath cost her effort. There was a strength in her, even as she slept, something unspoken that lingered in the room. He stepped forward and gently placed the child's resume on the bedside table. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said softly, "but I met your daughter today, and I don't think I'll ever be the same again." Emma sat in the chair beside her mother and looked up at Henry. She used to work a lot. She was a nurse. She helped people. But when she got sick, no one helped her. "That's why I came to you." Henry knelt beside the bed, one hand resting on the edge of the blanket. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And I'm going to help her now." The nurse entered a few minutes later to check vitals. She glanced at Henry, then at Emma, and seemed to sense this wasn't a typical visit. She whispered that Sarah had been holding steady for days, but would need advanced treatment. Treatment the clinic could no longer afford to continue. Henry listened carefully, asked precise questions, and when the nurse left, he stepped outside to make 2 calls. The first was to his personal physician, asking for a full evaluation of Sarah Miller's records and an immediate transfer to a private facility. The second was to his legal team, ordering a discreet financial arrangement to cover whatever came next, no matter the cost. When he returned to the room, Emma was resting her head beside her mother's hand. Her eyes fluttered with fatigue, but she looked up when he sat next to her. "Are you really going to help?" she asked. Henry reached for a small hand and held it gently. "Yes, Emma, I promise." He didn't fully understand what had happened that day, how a little girl with a backpack and a piece of paper had shattered his routine and cracked open a part of him he thought was long buried. But as he sat in that quiet hospital room, watching over a woman he didn't know and a child who had trusted him with everything, he knew this wasn't a detour. This was the beginning of something that would change his life forever. The following morning, Henry arrived at the hospital just after sunrise. He had barely slept the night before, his mind consumed by thoughts of Sarah and Emma. The image of the little girl sitting beside her mother's hospital bed had stayed with him like a weight on his chest. It wasn't pity that haunted him. It was responsibility, a kind he hadn't known before. Not the corporate kind that came with shareholders and deadlines, but a human kind. The kind that made you want to show up before anyone asked. When he stepped into the clinic, the nurses at the front desk greeted him with a mixture of surprise and reverence. He had already arranged for Sarah to be transferred that day to one of the private hospitals he funded through his company's foundation. Specialists had reviewed her file overnight, and a treatment plan had been drawn up with aggressive but hopeful measures. Everything was moving fast, but Henry wasn't interested in waiting around to let bureaucracy take over. He had watched too many decisions made slowly for the sake of process. This one was personal. This one would move at his pace. He walked down the now familiar hallway toward room 12, carrying a paper bag filled with breakfast, fruit, a muffin, and a small cup of cocoa. Emma was already awake, curled up in the chair beside her mother, her knees pulled to her chest. She looked up when he entered and gave him a sleepy smile, which, despite everything, still held the quiet power to soften him. He handed her the bag, and she took it with a small nod of thanks. Sarah was still asleep, her breathing steady but shallow. The machines around her quietly tracked each movement. Henry sat beside the bed and gently updated Emma on the plan. He explained that they were going to move her mom to a better hospital where she could get stronger treatment. Emma didn't ask questions. She just listened, holding the warm cup of cocoa between her hands like it was something sacred. "Will she wake up there?" she asked after a moment. Henry didn't offer empty promises. "She has a better chance now," he said, "and will be there every day." The transfer happened quietly just before noon. A private ambulance arrived, and Henry insisted on riding with them. Emma sat beside him, holding her mother's hand tightly, never once letting go during the ride. Henry made a few more calls while in the back of the vehicle, organizing a temporary room for Emma near the new hospital's pediatric wing and ensuring Sarah would have the best care available. By the time they arrived, a medical team was waiting. The room Sarah was taken to was bright and spacious with large windows that let in warm light. Emma immediately unpacked her small backpack and placed a drawing on the bedside table, a picture of her, her mom, and now someone new, Henry. His name was scrolled under the figure wearing a suit drawn with square shoulders and a smiling face. That evening, After the nurses had checked vitals and machines had been calibrated, Henry sat in the family lounge with Emma. She had changed into a clean sweater. One of the nurses had found her hair freshly brushed and tied back. She looked younger again, less guarded, like the weight of survival had loosened just enough to let childhood breathe. "Do you think she'll smile again?" Emma asked, her voice quiet. Henry looked at her seriously. "I do," he said, "and I think the first time she smiles, it'll be because of you." Emma didn't say anything in return, but she leaned into his side slightly, resting her head against his arm. He sat still, letting her stay there as long as she needed. No part of this felt strange to him anymore. He didn't question why he was here, why it mattered so much. Somewhere between that moment in his office and now, he had stopped viewing this as a temporary act of charity. He was invested, not just in saving Sarah's life, but in giving Emma back a piece of her childhood, a piece that had been taken too soon. As night fell and Emma settled into her temporary room for the night, Henry sat in the hallway, just outside Sarah's door. He didn't have a laptop open. No files, no calls, no spreadsheets, just him and the sound of monitors humming in the background. He looked through the glass, watching the rise and fall of Sarah's chest, and whispered more to himself than anyone else, "We're not done. We're just getting started." The fifth day marked a quiet but undeniable shift in the atmosphere surrounding Henry, Emma, and Sarah. Everything was still fragile, uncertain, and full of waiting, but there was now a sense of movement, as if something dormant had been gently stirred awake. Henry arrived early at the private hospital. Well before the staff began their daily rotations, he greeted the nurses by name, checked the latest medical reports, and made his way to the recovery wing, where Sarah was being monitored around the clock. Emma was already there, curled up beside her mother's bed, softly humming a tune that sounded like a lullaby. Her eyes were still sleepy, but when she saw Henry, she sat up straighter and smiled. Sarah's condition had not worsened overnight, which was more than they could have hoped for in recent days. The doctors reported slight but encouraging improvements. Her oxygen levels were stable, her blood pressure more consistent, and there were indications that her body was beginning to respond to the treatment. It was far from a recovery, but it was hope. Emma didn't ask too many questions. She listened closely to every update and repeated the words quietly under her breath, as if committing them to memory. Henry spent most of the morning in and out of meetings with specialists. He brought in a nutritionist to assess Sarah's needs once she was able to eat again. He spoke with a neurologist about potential complications and requested that every department handling her care send him daily updates. No matter how many calls or approvals it required, he handled each one himself. He had never micromanaged anything in his company. But this was different. This wasn't a project. This was a person, a mother, a daughter's whole world. Later that day, Henry took Emma to the hospital garden for some air. The nurses had found her a small jacket, and she skipped ahead, pausing to inspect every flower as if it might hold some kind of answer. Henry followed quietly, letting her lead. When they reached the far bench near a small fountain, she sat beside him and pulled out a folded piece of paper from her backpack. It was a drawing she'd made the night before. In it, 3 figures stood together, one with long hair, one small with a big smile, and one tall in a blue suit. She handed it to him without a word, and he looked at it for a long time before speaking. "Is that me?" he asked gently. Emma nodded. "You're part of us now," she said, "even if you don't have to be." Henry folded the drawing carefully and placed it inside his coat pocket. "I want to be," he said. "Not just today. Always." She didn't say anything right away, but her hand slipped into his, and that was enough. That evening, Henry stayed by Sarah's side while Emma fell asleep in the lounge nearby. He watched Sarah closely, noticing the small movements, an eyelid fluttering, fingers shifting against the blanket. He remembered what Emma had said earlier about how her mom used to sing to her when she couldn't sleep. So he began to speak softly, not singing, just telling stories from his own childhood. Stories he hadn't shared in decades. Stories about a mother who had worked 2 jobs, about falling asleep on the floor of her office, about believing one day he'd have enough money to make everything better. But when he looked at Sarah now and thought of Emma, he realized money wasn't what had saved them. It was love and showing up and the kind of bravery a child shouldn't have to carry, but sometimes did. By the time the monitors dimmed for the night and the room grew quiet again, Henry stayed in his chair, unmoving, watching over her. Something about the way her breathing sounded that night gave him the smallest sense that she knew he was there. That somewhere in the place between sleep and consciousness, Sarah understood that she and Emma were no longer alone. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but he knew this much. Whatever happened, he wouldn't walk away. He was all in now, and that changed everything. The sixth day began with a stillness that didn't feel like silence. It felt like anticipation. Henry arrived at the hospital just after sunrise, carrying 2 cups of cocoa and a small paper bag filled with warm pastries. He had stopped at the same corner bakery he'd passed every day for years, but never entered until this week. Now he knew the woman behind the counter by name. He knew which pastry Emma liked best. These were the kinds of details he'd once considered trivial. Now, they mattered more than anything. As he entered the hospital's pediatric lounge, he found Emma sitting cross-legged on the couch, a picture book in her lap, but her eyes weren't reading. They were fixed on the window, watching the light change. She turned when she saw him and smiled, the kind of tired but real smile that made his chest tighten. He handed her the cocoa and sat beside her without speaking. For a few moments, they simply sat in the warmth of early morning, sipping quietly, side by side like they'd done it 100 times. Today was different. The doctors had prepared him for the possibility that Sarah might wake up. Her vitals had continued to stabilize, and the neurologist reported promising brain activity. There were no guarantees, but hope was no longer just a fragile word whispered in passing. It was standing taller now, more real. Henry had arranged to work from the hospital that day. His team had adjusted. Meetings were pushed, calls redirected, and he'd brought his laptop just in case. But the truth was he wasn't interested in spreadsheets. Every moment his attention drifted. His eyes returned to the hallway that led to Sarah's room. Around midday, Emma and Henry went to visit her. The nurses had added fresh flowers by the window and rearranged the machines to make the space feel less clinical, more peaceful. Emma walked to the side of the bed and took her mother's hand, just as she always did. But today something changed. Sarah's fingers twitched in response. Then her eyelids fluttered. Henry stood motionless, his breath caught, his entire body focused on what might happen next. Slowly, painfully, Sarah opened her eyes. At first, her gaze was unfocused, her lips dry and unmoving, but then she blinked and turned her head ever so slightly. Her eyes landed on Emma, who was now crying softly, her fingers tightening around her mother's hand. "Mom," she whispered, barely audible. "It's me. I'm here." Sarah blinked again and in the weakest voice imaginable, whispered back, "Emma." The sound of her name seemed to fill the room like sunlight. Henry had never heard anything more fragile or more powerful. The nurse rushed in, followed by a doctor, and for a few minutes, the room filled with movement and clinical chatter. But Henry barely noticed. He stood at the edge of it all, his heart pounding, his eyes never leaving Sarah's. When the medical checks were done and the monitors calmed, Sarah looked at Henry for the first time. Her eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, carried recognition, not from memory, but from presence. She had felt him there. She knew without asking that he had stayed, that her daughter had not been alone. She tried to speak again, but her throat caught. Henry moved closer, gently taking her other hand. "Don't rush," he said. "We're not going anywhere." Emma climbed onto the side of the bed, laying her head near her mother's shoulder, careful not to disturb the wires. Sarah reached for her, her fingers brushing gently against her hair. That evening, after the excitement of the day settled, Henry sat with Emma outside in the hospital's garden courtyard. The air was cool, the sky deepening into shades of pink and gold. Emma leaned against him, wrapped in the jacket he bought her earlier that week. She said, "My name," she whispered. "That means she's still mine." Henry looked at her and nodded. "She was never gone," he said. "She was just finding her way back." Emma tilted her head to look up at him. "You helped her," she said. "You helped us." Henry didn't respond right away. He looked out at the fading sky, realizing that this little girl had changed him more in 6 days than anything else had in his entire life. She hadn't asked for wealth or promises. She had asked for time, for presence, for someone to care when the world didn't. As the first stars began to show, Henry made a silent vow. No matter what happened next, he wouldn't step away. Not now. Not ever. This wasn't just something he was doing for a few days out of kindness. This was his life now. And for the first time, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. On the seventh day, everything felt lighter. Not because the struggle was over, but because there was a visible beginning to something new. Sarah had spoken again that morning, a little stronger than the day before. Her voice was faint and raspy, but it carried emotion and recognition. She had asked for water, then for Emma, and then softly she had asked who the man beside her bed was. Emma had grinned and simply said, "That's Henry. He's helping us." Sarah's gaze had shifted to him, and though her face was tired, her eyes were clear. Henry had introduced himself again, more gently this time, not as a businessman, but simply as someone who had been trying to do the right thing. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. Sarah's progress was steady, and her body was responding well to the new treatment plan. She still had a long road ahead, but the danger of not waking up was behind her now. Emma barely left her mother's side, only stepping away when Henry coaxed her outside to eat or rest. She seemed to trust that her place in that room was safe again, that no one was going to take her away. Henry, too, had become a fixture in that hospital wing. He was no longer treated like a visitor, but like a part of the family. That afternoon, a social worker named Mara arrived for a follow-up. She had met Henry briefly when he'd first arranged Sarah's transfer, but had returned now to discuss next steps. They met in the small family room across from Sarah's unit, while Emma sat in a beanbag chair, drawing a picture of her mother with flowers in her hair. Mara reviewed the documents and updates that Henry's legal team had already submitted. She looked impressed, but remained thorough. "You've gone above and beyond," she said, flipping through the file. "Most people in your position offer a donation and walk away. But you've stayed. You've taken responsibility." Henry sat forward slightly. "Because it's not charity," he said. "It's family, even if it doesn't look the way people expect it to." Mara asked if he had considered becoming Emma's legal guardian, should the need arise. Henry hesitated, not because he didn't want to, but because it hadn't been a strategic decision. It had happened without formality, quietly, day by day, in the way he sat beside her in waiting rooms, carried her drawings in his pocket, and learned how she liked her toast. "Yes," he said finally. "If it ever comes to that, I want to be there for her." Later, Henry and Emma walked back into Sarah's room, and Sarah was awake again, her hands slowly moving across the blanket in search of her daughter. Emma climbed up beside her and showed her the drawing. "You have flowers now," she said, "because you're getting better." Sarah smiled weakly, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. Then she turned to Henry. "I know I didn't ask for help," she said softly, "but thank you for giving it anyway." Henry sat down beside the bed and looked at her, not like a man with power, not like a rescuer, but like someone who had needed this connection just as much. "Your daughter walked into my life and reminded me what matters," he said. "I should be thanking you." That evening, the three of them shared a quiet meal together. Hospital food warmed in the lounge microwave and eaten from paper trays. But to Emma, it felt like a feast. She told jokes and made her mother laugh, and Henry listened as if every word was a gift. The nurse on duty watched them with a smile, remarking later that it had been a long time since she'd seen so much life in that room. When it was time for Emma to sleep, Henry tucked her into the little fold-out bed beside Sarah's. As he sat nearby, Emma looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Do you think everything will stay like this?" she asked. Henry didn't lie. "It won't always be easy," he said, "but I'll be here. We'll get through it together." She reached for his hand and whispered, "I'm glad I came to your office." Henry squeezed her hand gently. "So am I," he said. "You changed everything." And as the hospital quieted for the night, Henry remained at their side. No longer a visitor, no longer a man living behind glass and wealth, but someone deeply rooted in a new life, one built not on titles or transactions, but on trust, love, and the unexpected courage of a little girl with a backpack and a hope too big to carry alone. The eighth day felt like the start of something neither of them had dared to believe in at the beginning. The hospital, once cold and sterile in Henry's mind, now held warmth in the quiet moments. It was in the way Emma ran down the hallway with her drawing tucked under her arm, in the way Sarah's voice grew just a little stronger with each passing hour, and in the way Henry no longer checked his phone every 10 minutes, but instead waited for Emma's stories like they were the most important meetings he could attend. That morning, Sarah sat up in her hospital bed on her own for the first time. Her cheeks had a faint blush of color, and her eyes were clearer than they had been in over a week. Emma was practically glowing as she fed her mom spoonfuls of warm oatmeal and told her about everything that had happened while she'd been asleep. She spoke about the garden, the cocoa, and how Henry helped her by new markers. She even shared the story of how she came into his office, how scared she had been, and how sure she had felt that he would listen. Sarah listened, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from pain or fear, but from the overwhelming realization that she hadn't lost everything after all. Henry stepped outside to give them a moment alone and found himself lingering in the hallway, staring at a framed painting on the wall that he'd never noticed before. It was a watercolor of a tree, strong and full, but its roots spread unevenly beneath it, touching stones, cracks, and buried things. For the first time in a long while, he understood the metaphor without forcing himself to. Things don't have to grow perfectly to be alive. They just need space, light, and time. Later that day, he met with Sarah's lead physician and social worker. They informed him that Sarah would likely be moved to a recovery suite within a few days and could begin rehabilitation by the following week. There was hope now, not just for survival, but for healing. Sarah would be able to walk again, to work again in time, but most importantly, she would be able to live. After the meetings, Henry returned to the room to find Emma drawing a new picture. This one was of a house, a bright sun, and three figures standing outside: a woman, a man in a suit, and a girl with a ponytail holding both their hands. He sat down beside her and asked, "Where's this?" She smiled and said, "Our home, when we're all together." He swallowed the tightness in his throat and told her softly, "Then let's make that real." By early evening, he had already taken steps to prepare an apartment for them in one of his buildings near the city's botanical gardens. It was temporary until Sarah was strong enough to decide what came next, but it was warm and open with plenty of space for Emma's art and books, and even a small desk Henry had ordered for her after seeing her scribble on hospital trays. That night, before he left, Sarah reached for his hand. Her voice was quiet but steady. "You changed our lives," she said. He looked at her, humbled and deeply moved. "You changed mine first," he replied. "Emma walked into my office and reminded me of everything I forgot how to be." When he kissed Emma goodnight and turned to leave, she ran after him and hugged him tightly around the waist. "You'll come back tomorrow, right?" she asked. He knelt down, held her close, and whispered, "I'm not going anywhere." As he stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights blinking across the skyline, Henry realized something profound. The man who had once built his world on deals and deadlines now had something far more valuable. A little girl had walked into his life and changed its trajectory with 5 words: "I need a job, please." And in answering her plea, he had found the only position that ever truly mattered: being someone who stayed. Being someone who chose love over comfort, people over power, and purpose over pride. He had finally come home. The ending of this story resonates deeply because it doesn't rely on grand gestures or dramatic miracles. It's quiet, personal, and earned through small human moments. What makes it so powerful is the transformation that takes place not just in Henry, but in the way we as readers come to understand what truly matters. A man who once measured success in numbers and control discovers that real meaning comes from showing up, staying, and choosing people over power. Emma's bravery isn't sensationalized. It's honest, driven by love and necessity. Sarah's strength, even in her silence, holds everything together. The beauty of this ending is that it doesn't pretend everything will be perfect, but promises that no one will face what comes next alone. That message, That love is an action, a decision, a commitment, is timeless. To me, this is not just a story about saving someone else. It's a story about being saved by the very act of caring. In a world often ruled by distance and distraction, that reminder is both shocking and quietly profound.